Welcome back, everyone. As you can see, I have Susan Sloate here again for our episode 2 of our three-part series leading up to the date of 11/22. Susan, how are you?
I am terrific. How are you?
I'm good. I posted our last video. We got quite a few comments, which is good. We can save those for the third episode like we discussed, and then we'll kind of just take Q&As for anyone who wants to ask a question. We'll answer that in the third episode. But today, Susan has sent me a list of people that were involved with the assassination. Some of them I know about, but there's a couple that I don't. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, Susan, and just to educate myself more on the people that were around this assassination. So the first one, we talked a little bit about him in the first episode, but LBJ. Okay, we talked about how he's no bueno, not good. People even said like, well, my mom went to school with him and he was not a nice person. So let's start with him. Let's start with LBJ. What can you tell us about him and his involvement in the assassination?
Well, here's the thing. I did a talk many years ago at a seniors group locally, and one of the questions afterward was someone said, "What was the motivation for the crime?" And I said, "How much time have you got?" Because basically, there were so many different people who had different motivations. And I find that extremely interesting, but it kind of goes to human nature because if you think about it, so many people are so involved with just what they themselves care about that their motivation can be very small and very petty. And you'll see as we get into today, some of the motivations that we're dealing with were not big, enormous, life-changing things. They were very small and petty things. So starting with LBJ, by the way, LBJ was a man who had come up from being a school teacher in Texas and had risen in local politics to national politics, where he had been the party's head of the Senate, sort of the same position that Chuck Schumer has right now. Okay, because basically the except that wait a minute, he was also was he wasn't I think he was the head of the Senate. And that was, as far as he was concerned, that was as far as he was really going to be able to go. And then here's where it gets interesting. In 1960, he ran for president in the Democratic primary. And most people do not know that. They don't realize he ever ran for president, but he did. And he ran from the Senate thinking he had a really good base there. But it started to look from, not too far off that JFK was going to get the nomination. Well, JFK got the nomination. And what happened? Not too long afterwards, before the nominating convention, he offered the spot to LBJ, knowing that he needed Texas to win and that LBJ would bring him Texas, and that he would also needed some of the states in the South to win. So he figured that LBJ would be useful there. But he also knew that LBJ would not take it, just wouldn't take it because there wasn't enough power. This was 1960, and that was the time when pretty much vice presidents didn't do very much. The vice president who runs all over the world and does things is a relatively recent thing that we now think of as, oh, this is normal, but it isn't. And in fact, back in the 30s, there was a Pulitzer Prize winning musical, the very first musical that ever won a Pulitzer Prize, called Of Thee I Sing, which was about a man becoming president. His vice president was so insignificant that he had to take a White House tour to get into the White House. That gives you an idea of how important he was. So anyway, point that I'm making is that LBJ gets offered the spot and the Kennedy brothers know he's going to turn it down. And then he accepts it. And this throws them both for a loop. They didn't expect it. They didn't think it was going to happen. But Jack did not believe that he could then go back on his word. He had said he wanted him and he took him. And there you are.
Mhm.
So LBJ gets into the vice presidential mansion and he starts doing business the way he does business, which is basically very crooked. There's a lot of money changing hands. There's a lot of bribes going back and forth. And so what ended up happening was it became very clear, and not too long into this whole process, it started to become clear that he was doing some very illegal things in the vice presidential mansion. And so they found, I think, was it Bobby Baker? Am I getting this wrong? There were at least two different men who had been involved with LBJ. They were old Texas cronies, and they were leading him in the wrong direction, bringing him bribe money, doing all kinds of stuff. And so what ended up happening was it became very clear that LBJ could not remain on the 1964 ticket with JFK. That just wasn't going to work, especially since it was very clear he was going to be prosecuted and probably was going to go to jail.
Wow.
So LBJ, of course, wanted to be president. Do you think he had the slightest motivation for wanting to see Kennedy dead?
Yeah, and is it true that the Kennedy brothers used to call him some kind of a nickname that was like a derogatory name? They just did not like him at all.
Oh, they didn't like him at all. I don't know about the derogatory nickname. I may have read it somewhere, but it wasn't something that particularly stuck with me. But they didn't like him. Bobby couldn't stand him. Jack wasn't far behind. They knew that with everything coming up and the legal stuff having actually reached some of the media, who were printing it, it was shocking that there was any possibility he was going to be able to stay. But here's the thing. LBJ had to become president in order to get rid of all of the illegal things that were going on around him. Only if he became president would they go away. And of course, as you know, they did go away right after he became president. It was never mentioned again. But the part that's interesting here is that um, he could not have a situation where, for example, the Republican won the White House in 1964 because then LBJ, is out in the cold. And again, he could have gotten prosecuted. So it was a situation where he had to have the guarantee that he was going to be able to get into the White House, but JFK wasn't going to obligingly keel over for him. That was obvious. And he wasn't going to quit his job. That was also obvious. And it was furthermore obvious that JFK was so popular with the American people, despite the Cuban Missile Crisis and all the things that had happened. Despite all of that, they were going to reelect him. That was very clear. So the only way they could get rid of him was to get rid of him the way they did in Dallas. And so he was aware of this. And the night before Kennedy was killed, they had flown to Fort Worth, which is really only about a 20-minute or 30-minute drive from Dallas. And yet they ended up flying into Dallas for the optics of it, if you think about it. Anyway, they get to Fort Worth, and LBJ spent the night, or at least part of the night, with his mistress, Madeline Brown. And he told her, after tomorrow, the Kennedys aren't going to be a problem for me anymore. And she never forgot what he said. So take it for what it's worth. But not only did he know that all this was happening, he also was extremely connected to the Texas oil men. That's another one who should be on your list, which I forgot to list for you. The Texas oil people had a very good reason for wanting to get rid of JFK as well. And he was very well connected to them and had gotten campaign contributions from them and had kind of looked after their interests in the Senate, that kind of thing. Um, so he was well aware of what was going on. And he, one of the things that's very interesting, if you actually look at the film footage on the day, you see when they make the hairpin turn at Elm Street, LBJ ducks down in the car, which is very shocking because he's way behind JFK's car, and there's no real reason for him to do that, but he does it. Furthermore,
Wow.
his Secret Service agent, Rufus Youngblood, was actually there and apparently when all this happened, jumped on top of LBJ and pushed him down in the car. Because, well, he was far back, so he could actually do that. He could jump off the following car, which was the Secret Service car, and run behind him. But the whole point is that LBJ later honored Rufus Youngblood and said, "Oh, he saved my life, blah, 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 blah," to try to make it look like he had been in some kind of danger, which he never ever was, not for 1 second. So take that for what it's worth, if that's helpful.
I did
Another,
not know that he
yes.
had slumped down like that. Wow.
Oh yeah, you have to look at the film footage, but it's not that easy to find, but it's there. Also, Ario Nasus, that's another one I forgot about. So the Texas Oilman and Ario Nasus remind me about that. Anyway, so he had a compelling reason for needing to be president, so his legal problems would go away. So he actually had the power of the presidency, which he desperately wanted. He was extremely controlled, by the way, by the people who were supporting him. There was no way he was going to go against their interests. But he also, like this huge ego, he wanted to be president, right? And one of the things that's very interesting is after he was sworn in on Air Force One, his his wife's press secretary gave her back the Bible that he had been sworn in on, which we used in Forward to Camelot. It
Mhm.
was the Bible, except it was actually a Catholic missal. It was a prayer book that had been given to JFK and personalized for him a few weeks or so before he actually went to Dallas, and he hadn't had it for a very long time. And it was the only thing on Air Force One that they could use, so they used that, and he was sworn in on it. Afterwards, the Mrs. Johnson's press secretary, um, Liz, whose name I can't remember, sorry, um, she gave the book to Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson, the whole idea was that she was going to be able to talk about it to the press. Now, the interesting thing is nobody in the press cared. They couldn't have cared less about the new president. The story was the president who had died, and they hardly even paid attention. When she was going on and on about this, it was like it didn't matter to them. It just didn't matter. And this had to be a huge kick in this man's ego because, President of the United States is a pretty big job. And having just gotten the job, you never know. Also, by the way, there are photographs. You can look these up. On Air Force One, when he takes the oath, he's very, very solemn. And Jackie Kennedy's standing next to him in her bloody coat and all this other stuff. And she just looked, anguished in every possible way. There are a couple of photographs taken right after he had finished the oath. He's looking at someone else in the plane and he's given the biggest grin you ever saw in your whole life. Hey, I made it, Ma. I'm here. It's very funny, but it's also very, very sad. It really is. So that's LBJ. That's his motivation. He also, by the way, as a way of heading off any investigations that would be done in Dallas, he set up a blue ribbon committee called the Warren Commission, which was named for Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time. And this is what he's going to be remembered for the rest of his rest of eternity, is actually having been the person chairing this Blue Ribbon Commission. Because the truth of the matter is that it was such a badly done job. It was so sloppy. There were so many things that were ignored. There were so many things that were brushed under the rug. It was horrible. We will talk, I think, about Bobby Hargis in the third one. That's another one we want to definitely talk about because he had a piece of testimony that more or less said that his testimony more or less proved that there had been a conspiracy, and they brushed him under the rug as well. So, point is that Warren Commission was nothing but a whitewash. It was total fiction. It was intended to be fiction. And it says something that one of the most prominent people on it, the only one who attended every single one of the meetings that they had because he had the time to do it, was Allen Dulles, the former head of the CIA, who had been fired by Kennedy himself after the Bay of Pigs in 1961. He was retired, so he had all kinds of time, right?
Right. And let's not forget, I'll just inject this quick. Gerald Ford was part of the Warren Commission.
Was.
JFK Jr. interviewed Gerald Ford in one of his George magazines. And in that interview, Gerald Ford basically reiterated that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and he stands by that. So he told the son of the slain president that, yep, he lied right to his face in one of his George magazines. So I thought that was incredibly just it's interesting, but it's just disrespectful. I mean, he clearly knew that that
Of
was
course he
that
did.
was not what happened.
Part that's fascinating about Gerald Ford on the Warren Commission is something that most people don't know, and that is the fact that he took actual classified information from the Warren Commission and used it in a book that he wrote and published not too long afterwards. So,
JFK Jr. asked him about that book. You just reminded me. So yeah, I think I don't know. Just picture yourself, you're JFK Jr. Your father dies horribly, and then this person's on this Warren Commission. They come up with this bogus explanation. You have him
assuring
in
you
front
that
of
what we
you.
found is absolutely true and blah 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 blah.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
he
that
lies
is
right to your face in your political magazine. It's pretty crazy.
it's a very sad thing. Of course, by that time, JFK Jr. had been a lawyer, so any investigative powers that he had or any curiosity that he certainly could have satisfied. But the point is that Gerald Ford, if the government ran the way it was supposed to, should have been prosecuted for using classified information in a book that he used for and sold for commercial purposes. Absolutely. I mean, he
Right,
didn't to do that, but he did it anyway. So give you an idea of how well the Warren Commission worked, right?
right,
Yeah,
absolutely.
exactly. So who else are we talking about here now?
So we also have J. Edgar Hoover on here,
Ah,
who you said wasn't involved in the event, but was
right.
involved in the cover up. So let's hear about
Yes.
that.
J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI, the director of the FBI, and he had made that organization what it was, starting in the 1920s when he was going after gangsters and prohibition people and stuff like that. And it ended up being, he ended up becoming very, very famous and very well known as America's greatest crime fighter and all this kind of thing. In Washington right now, the FBI building is named the J. Edgar Hoover Building. So take that for what it's worth. However, remember we were talking before about people who are very petty about certain things. They only see what they want to see.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at that time, in the federal government, in the civil service, basically you had a mandatory retirement for everybody, no exceptions, at the age of 65. J. Edgar Hoover was coming up on his 65th birthday in January of 1964, and he wanted to stay as head of the FBI. He wanted it desperately. But he also knew the Kennedy brothers were going to retire him. There's no question in his mind. LBJ, on the other hand, had been his neighbor. They'd lived on the same street in Washington for years and years. So there was definitely more of how should we say this, more of an affinity that LBJ had for J. Edgar Hoover, which is kind of interesting. Also, by the way, and this is something, if you don't know it, this is certainly part of the story. J. Edgar Hoover kept um, files on everybody for blackmail purposes. And he used his organization to gather information on powerful people in order to be able to keep them under his own control. Okay, that was part of the jewel of his little baby that he was taking care of, this FBI. Um, at one point early in Kennedy's presidency, he went and visited them in the White House, and he said, I wanted to bring this to your attention because there have been some concerns about this, and we think that there might be someone who might be trying to use this information to your detriment, and I want to protect you from it. And he was basically gave him information. I can't remember if it was on Marilyn Monroe or if it was on Judith Campbell, who was having an affair with both JFK and Sam Giancana at the same time and passing information back and forth between them. Whatever it was, the point was is that J. Edgar Hoover walked in with all this information and more or less told the President of the United States, I got something on you, and you better just do what I want. Okay. Now, this did not work very well with the Kennedy brothers because they were not about to be blackmailed. That just wasn't going to happen. So the whole point is that J. Edgar Hoover had a vested interest in helping LBJ move his agenda along because if LBJ was accepted as the legitimate president of the United States following the death of JFK, then J. Edgar Hoover would be in a pretty good position. And it turns out that he was, because what happened was LBJ became president, and I don't know how long afterward it was, but this is actually even brought up in the movie All the President's Men in the dialogue. He actually held a press conference and appointed J. Edgar Hoover head of the FBI for life. Yeah, this was shocking. You just don't do that when the mandatory retirement age in the federal government is 65. He didn't care. Now, interestingly enough, J. Edgar Hoover died in 1972 of a heart attack. Now, I have read other things that say that the investigators who arrived there to get the body and whatever found like a powder of some sort sprinkled over stuff in his bathroom.
Oh,
And yeah, you never know. And what's interesting about all of that is that the time in 1972 when it happened, I believe was before the Watergate break-in had occurred, which was June of 72.
yeah.
Nixon, as he was going through all of his trials later on with Watergate, he said, if J. Edgar Hoover was still alive, this wouldn't be happening to me.
Hmm.
So take it for what it's worth. But J. Edgar
Wow.
Hoover, like I say, had basically a very petty reason for wanting to remain head of the FBI. It was literally his life. He didn't want to give it up. He didn't want to be retired, and he was perfectly willing to let something happen to JFK if it meant that he was going to get the opportunity to remain the head of the FBI.
A lot of people talk about George Bush,
Yes,
H.W. Bush. Will you, and a lot of people even say that he was there that day. There's a picture that looks just like him, and people
I
say
know.
he can't recall where he was at the time of the shooting. So do you want to talk about George H.W. Bush too while we're
I can. Now, here's one of the interesting things, by the way. The idea that he said, I don't know where I was. Nobody didn't know where they were. This was the first event that actually happened in American popular culture where everybody remembered where they were when they heard JFK had been killed. Everybody. So the idea that he didn't know where he was is lunacy. And it's ludicrous too, because he was, he was a businessman. He was doing his job. He was doing whatever he was doing. He was involved at that time with Texas Oil and was making money steadily and all kinds of other stuff. He was not involved with the Texas oil men because these were people who had made fortunes in oil. He was only at the point where he was working on that stuff at that point. He had not gotten to that level. And he never actually did, as far as I know. As far as I'm aware, he never got to the levels of, multimillionaire that these guys actually were. So take that for what it's worth. But he was there was an interesting thing that showed up in the CIA files some years later that said something about George W. Bush having been briefed on the Kennedy assassination. And I think this was after Bush had become CIA director. Okay, and that would have been, I'm not even sure, I can't even remember when that was, tell you the truth.
Yeah, it's
Um, but it wasn't, I think it might have been when around the time of Nixon being president, I'm not sure. Anyway, point is that he um he strenuously denied that he had been briefed. He said there was someone else named George Bush in the CIA at the time, and I'm sure it was probably him. Well, the investigators, these very interested researchers, went to the guy who had been that George Bush in the CIA at the time, and that guy said, "Nope, never happened to me. I wasn't senior enough to be briefed." So if someone else was being briefed and had my name, then it's him. It's not me.
I just looked it up. He became the director of the CIA, or director of Central Intelligence, DCI, for the CIA on January 30th, 1976. He served in this role until January 20th, 77, for nearly 1 year under Gerald Ford.
Yeah, yeah, well, and Gerald Ford was all establishment, was all, there are a lot of the people involved there. In fact, what's very interesting is his vice president during his very brief presidency was Nelson Rockefeller,
Yeah.
super New World Order guy,
Yep.
so a lot of that stuff, he was more or less told, okay, well, Nixon's not president anymore, so you need to do this. And
Mhm.
he just followed all the recommendations. He didn't,
Right.
he just didn't have that kind of a power base or whatever to do all these other things. So anyway, point is that is what ended up happening with Gerald Ford. There's always been some thought that he was there, but there was also some thought that George W. Bush, his son, was there as well. Now, never been sure about that. But
Hmm. How old would he have
he
been
would have
in
been about
73?
16 or 17, something like that at the time.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it would have been, a teenager or whatever, but if he was in fact there, if Bush was there, then he was sort of like he may have been hanging out around the steps of the school book depository, but he wasn't, um, as far as anyone could tell, he was not like with someone else where you could see someone he was having conversations with or anything. The photographs I've seen basically show a man standing close to the edge of the building and really not interacting with anyone else. So take that for what it's worth. But Bush, um, Bush was president when they formed the Assassination Records Review Board in 1992. Now,
Right.
this was the time when Bill Clinton was running for president, but I'm pretty sure that Bush was not one of those people who was excited about the idea of getting these things released. The only reason that they were released is because Oliver Stone was called in front of Congress. He spoke passionately about the need to do this for the uh, for the American people, for them to know what was really going on. And he actually carried the day because the film was extremely popular. The film is JFK, and the film is very, very popular. And he made a point of basically saying, look, there still is enormous interest in this topic, and it would behoove you to let the American people see what you had. It's pretty
Yeah.
much so. Yeah,
I was just looking for that picture of
I've
George.
seen it. I know what you're talking about, but that's it. Yes, that's it. Looks a
Yeah.
lot like him, doesn't it?
It does. This picture says that there's noticeable differences between the nose, chin, and hairline, but you know, Who knows? I mean, a lot of people discuss that, and a lot of people think that, JFK Jr. named George magazine after George H.W. Bush because he was the person responsible for the assassination. I'm not so sure about that because JFK Jr. said multiple times it's George, as in George Washington. And there's a George Washington little, logo, or not logo, but a little picture of George Washington on the covers that you're supposed to find. So I'm not 100%
I
sure.
don't think he had enough power at that time to do that because the amount of coordination involved would have been beyond what I think he was really beyond his pay grade at that time. I don't think so.
Right. Right. That's kind of how I feel. I know a lot of people in the comments are going to disagree because that's what we keep hearing is that the reason is because of this. And I'm not saying either way. I'm just saying that's just it's hard to believe because he didn't really have a ton of power back then. At least not. It doesn't appear he did. Maybe he did some in some other capacity, but not to the outside
Not
world.
in the life that we know of at this point.
Right.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes. At this point, not in the life that we know of. So yes. Um, okay. The next person were the anti-Castro Cubans, including
Yes.
Alpha 66. This is what I have never heard of, so I'm anxious to hear about this.
Okay. Many people from Cuba over the years had made every effort to get to the United States. And the real reason for that is that when Castro came in 1959, he more or less destroyed the island. I'm sure you probably know the story that there are people who actually have cars on the island, and they were like American Fords and GM products and all this stuff, and they're still running today because they cannot afford for them not to run because they cannot get parts, they cannot get whatever. So they have to kind of like improvise and keep those cars running. It's the only shot that they have.
Wow.
What happened was is that the Kennedy brothers in 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis began, they started a blockade of Cuba and they basically stopped exporting any of their goods to Cuba. So that went on for decades, just decades. And the whole point is Cuba became a far poorer country as a result because there had been an enormous amount of American business in Cuba before all of this happened. In fact, the mafia had had casinos in Cuba. That would be another reason why the mafia wanted to take out JFK. They lost a lot of business when
Oh,
Castro nationalized all that stuff,
mhm.
and so the whole point is that there was just an enormous amount of hatred from the anti-Castro Cubans who had seen their friends and family suffer while Castro came to power and all the things that happened. They'd seen friends, lovers, husbands, daughters thrown into prison, some of them executed, and they couldn't wait to get out. They got out, they got to many of them into Miami, and they created a Cuban community there, which still thrives to this day. And the truth is that these people hated Castro with a passion. They loved Cuba. They hated Castro and they wanted him gone. And they made it very, very clear to the members of the American government, specifically the CIA, that they were willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. Okay, so what was actually happening here is you've got a lot of like native Cubans who want to go back to Cuba, desperately want to go back, but can't do it as long as Castro is there. And you have the CIA who'd like to take Castro out altogether because he's making things really difficult and they'd like to return American interests to Cuba if they can. And what happens, and I'm sure you know this, when you have a situation where you have a group of very passionate people and you have another group who are actually working with them, that second group can take on some of the characteristics of the first group. The idea being that they will develop sympathies and understandings, and so and so's dad was murdered there. How can you not want to do some of this stuff? So the CIA guys, to their credit, if you want to put it that way, um, really got involved with a lot of what was going on, and they really got emotionally caught up in what the anti-Castro Cubans wanted to do. um, as part of that, there were a number of anti-Castro groups in the United States, one of which was Alpha 66. Alpha 66 was the most violent of all of the anti-Castro groups. It was the one that was willing to do bombings and industrial sabotage and pretty much anything you want, in order to destroy Castro's hold on Cuba. And what's interesting about all of that is that the man who founded it, Antonio Veciana had been an accountant in Cuba. I don't know how many people you know who are accountants who also do industrial sabotage on the side, but he did that.
Must have really ticked him off.
Oh, yes, very funny. I don't know what happened that actually made him do that. I did read a very, very good book that actually dealt with him, at least partially. A man named Gayton Fonzi, Fonzi,
Mhm.
was an investigator for the 1977 House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was the second governing body, like the Warren Commission, trying to look into the Kennedy assassination. Okay. And Gayton Fonzi was one of their investigators. He did a lot of really good work for them. And he wrote a book called The Last Investigation, in which he discussed how handcuffed the House Select Committee had actually been, how stuff disappeared, it was altered. It was, their offices were bugged. All kinds of things were done to them, to keep this thing going. Because remember, it's at this point, it's only 14 years after the assassination. So these people might have a vested interest in wanting to make sure that they weren't going to go to prison or anything bad was going to happen. So Gayton Fonzi had a meeting at one point with Antonio Veziana. He wanted to talk to him about his role with Alpha 66 and the anti-Castro Cubans, and he met him um, somewhere. I can't remember where, but he talked to Antonio Veziana about a meeting that this guy had gone to. He had gone to meet his own contact, his own CIA contact, whose name was Maurice Bishop. Okay,
Mhm.
and this was in September of 1963, and this was in a public place. Can't remember exactly where it was, but it was a place where there would have been like, I don't want to say it was a mall, but it was something like that, where there was like a table he could sit at, but there was also like a little fountain and there's all kinds of stuff. And across the way, he saw Maurice Bishop, who was talking to someone else at that time, and it was Lee Harvey Oswald.
Wow.
He positively identified Oswald for Gayton Fonzi, which was just explosive information at that time because no one wanted to believe that Oswald was anything but a lone nut. That just wasn't happening. And then what happened is that Maurice Bishop finished his conversation with Oswald and Oswald left, and then he came over and met with Vetsiana, the scheduled meeting that they have, and he Vetsiana gave Gayton Fonzi, the investigator, a description of this guy, and they did like a sketch thing, like the sketch artists do.
Mhm.
And he came out with a sketch and said to Vatiana, "Is this what you saw?" And he said, "Yes, that's Maurice Bishop. That's the guy I was meeting with." Maurice Bishop, interestingly enough, bore a 100% resemblance to David Atlee Phillips. David Atlee Phillips was the head of the Western Hemisphere CIA office at the time. He was very high up within CIA circles, very involved on the anti-Castro Cuban side, and he had been the guy under an alias, obviously, who was meeting with Oswald in September of 1963 in Dallas.
Wow.
I know. Interesting, huh?
I have to share this story. This just is a random story, and I don't think I've shared this with our audience before, but there's a my daughter plays volleyball, and one of the parents said that her mom had a story about the CIA and the Kennedy assassination. So I was like, can I call her and just talk to her about it? And she's like, absolutely. So I called this woman, and she recalls being a young girl, and she lived in Washington, D.C., and her dad worked for the CIA and was very secretive, wouldn't tell them much about anything that he did. It was just, she just knew he worked with the CIA and they lived in Washington, D.C. They had just bought a house in DC right when that assassination had happened. She said that they hadn't even unpacked all of their stuff, and they were sent to move. They were moved away from Washington D.C. and sent to Omaha, Nebraska. So they got them the heck out of Washington D.C. She has no idea what the urgency was, but obviously it was at that time, and they didn't even have a chance to unpack their stuff in their new house in D.C. So they moved to Omaha, and her father was very secretive, wouldn't talk about stuff, obviously. And then he died mysteriously. I can't remember exactly if it was a heart attack or what it was exactly. But she said the very next day, the CIA showed up at their house, completely ransacked everything, took everything out of his safe. It was gone. So I'm like, I wonder what your father knew. She goes, I think about that a lot, but then I'm also kind of glad I don't know. So it's crazy how close to home these things hit. this many years later. You still find connections all over the place.
Oh
So
yeah. And the nice thing is when you have people who have good memories, who can remember specific scenes they can talk to you about, that stuff really stays with you. Did she give you an idea of what year they moved out of Washington to Omaha? Did she tell you that?
I think it was in 63. It was right after the assassination.
Okay, then
Yep.
that there might have been a very good reason. And if you have like her father's name, that would be interesting to know as well, because in fact there were some CIA people who did die mysteriously. And one of the ones that I remember, and I hope I'm not remembering this incorrectly, but there was a story that I read when I was reading about David Atlee Phillips that he had visited a guy named William, God, I can't remember his name, somebody who had been involved with one of the other CIA offices,
Hmm.
and he had visited him at home. The guy was up on a ladder and he was doing some stuff, whatever it was, while they were talking. And the conversation was about a book that he was writing. He had written some and it hadn't been finished yet, but he was talking about it and whatever. All I know is, if I remember my story correctly, he fell off the ladder and died mysteriously, and the manuscript vanished. No one ever saw it again. Take it for
Wouldn't it be interesting to know the number of people who
who.
are just around this one event, just the assassination, how many people died mysteriously, went missing that were directly connected to.
Well, we actually have a very large list, actually, and it goes. I mean, it reaches so many different people because one of the major people in the DC CIA area was a guy named Cord Meyer,
Mhm.
whose wife Mary was a very pretty and talented housewife. She was an artist or something. She and JFK were having an affair pretty much at the time that he died, and she kept a diary.
Hmm.
And one day she went jogging and ended up shot dead. And interestingly enough, the diary, of course, disappeared. Nothing ever happened. Cord Meyer at that point, I think they were divorced or something, I'm not sure. But the point is that it all just, there's a huge list of people, and it also it goes to people like um the guy in the uh his last name is Bowers. He was in the railroad tower overlooking Dealey Plaza, and he was directing trains on the day of the assassination. He right at the time of the assassination, and he actually sort of, I think it probably with peripheral vision, kind of saw or felt like a flash of light and a puff of smoke from the grassy knoll,
Wow.
not from behind him, but from the grassy knoll at the time of the shooting, that he couldn't completely describe or explain. It was never pursued at the Warren Commission, and a few years later, he ended up dead in a strange one-car accident on a deserted road in Texas for no particular reason. Yeah, so there are literally hundreds, and there were quite a few that happened after the assassination, after 63, and then when 77 came around, we there was Johnny Roselli, there was Sam Giancana, there was a whole bunch of other people. There was George de Mohrenschildt, I told you about him. There's so many people that were also taken out because they had managed to survive that first set of whatever, and they were not going to survive the second one because people were asking questions, and they were going to have to testify under oath. So take that for what it's worth. But yes, that was definitely a part of it as well, for sure.
That's crazy. So we talked about the CIA. We talked about, a little bit about the mafia. We just talked about the CIA.
So the
And
CIA, there's more to talk about with the CIA, and this
yeah,
is important. The CIA had their own motivation for taking out Kennedy, okay? And it wasn't just the specific sympathies that the people working with the anti-Castro Cubans had. That wasn't the real reason. After the Bay of Pigs in 1961, Kennedy was absolutely furious because the CIA had gotten him to approve the invasion of Cuba, right? Using anti-Castro Cubans, training them, equipping them, all this other kind of thing. And unfortunately, they happened to drop them down into one of Castro's favorite hunting grounds. They were pretty much dead ducks from the second they got there. And so the CIA came back to him and said, look, all you need to do is just send some planes over. That's all we need to do, just provide some air cover for these guys to escape from the beach. He didn't do it. he wasn't going to escalate anything. He was brand new as president and he just wasn't going to do it. And it was just a horrifying failure for him, one of his first as president, really bad. And he took full responsibility for it. But he was so angry because he said the CIA had lied to him and tried to trap him into doing all of this stuff and starting a full-out war with Cuba, which could have led to war with the Soviet Union
Yeah.
because it was, in fact, the Cold War at the time and the Soviet Union was on Cuba's side. It was really bad. Anyway, so what he said was, I'm going to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and cast the pieces into the wind. Okay. And he wasn't kidding. He immediately took the intelligence operations that the CIA was involved with and turned them over to the military, okay, which is unprecedented. Doesn't happen, not happening, not at all. And it was just horrifying. And it never quite went the way it should have. But if you've seen Mr. X's speech in JFK, you'll understand a little bit more about it because he's coming at it from the side of military intelligence and he would have had that kind of information at the time.
Hmm.
So taking it for what it's worth, the CIA wanting to continue on and pretty much be a government unto themselves and do whatever they wanted to do and make any decisions they wanted to make. The truth of the matter is they had a very, very good reason for wanting to see Kennedy taken out. It made total sense. And that really goes to continuing their own existence. That was what was important.
Yeah. I have a shirt on my website that has like this picture of JFK and then it's got that quote on it just because it's that was the start of something big. I feel like
It
up to
was,
that point we really didn't know the extent of it, of how bad and how autonomous the CIA had become. And then when he said that, it's like, wow, okay, why would our president want to splinter this,
uh,
US organization into 1,000 pieces? So I think that was like a turning point for a lot of Americans that started questioning the CIA because it was such a public uh,
well, but the thing is, I don't know whether that was something that was ever made public, that quote. It may have happened afterwards, but it's interesting to know that JFK truly did not believe that the CIA threatened his own power the way it did. I
Yeah.
don't think he was aware of what a monster it had become. Because try to remember, it had only become an official organization with the name that it had in like 1948 or 49. So it'd only been around for 13 or 14 years, and yet it had become this monstrous organization where they didn't answer to anybody. They just did what they wanted to do, and that was that, you
It
know.
was it was 47. It was 1947, and that's the same year that Hillary Clinton was born.
That'll tell you something, right? All these good people
Right.
all in one place. Yeah, what a shame they didn't include her. Honestly. Now, what's very interesting, by the way, is one of the things that I always thought was very interesting. There have been some questions over the years about the Watergate reporters, Woodward and Bernstein.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is something that you're aware of, but there is some thought. They've always wondered how Bob Woodward, who was who had been in the military and had been only on the Washington Post for 9 months, suddenly gets the opportunity to actually cover this huge story, which becomes this monstrous big thing. And there was some thought that he was actually either military intelligence or CIA, and that he was getting briefings regularly. So,
Yeah.
take,
You know what's crazy, Susan, is that JFK Jr. interviewed him too. JFK Jr. interviewed Fidel Castro,
really,
Gerald Ford, yep. Uh, Vietnamese General Va Giap, who was the guy that was in office when Kennedy was there, and he interviewed who were we just talking about? Gosh, the most recent
do
guy.
the same thing. I'm doing the same.
Bernst or not Bernstein, Woodward. Bob Woodward is he interviewed. So it is interesting that I feel like JFK Jr. was trying to like show us this picture of all these characters that were around JFK and that um, the possibility of the fact that these people were placed in certain positions. They didn't earn that. They were placed there because of what they were capable of doing and what they would actually carry out. So it's very interesting who he chose to interview. I think that says a lot.
Well, it also tells you something about how much access he had. He could pick up the phone and say, "Hi, this is John Kennedy," and he could get interviews with people who wouldn't speak to anyone else.
Right.
So his value to George was unmeasurable, really.
It
It was,
really was. Yeah.
he did some just amazing things. So and I think you may not necessarily be wrong that he may be trying to show us something or that he had an idea. You know, this is the same guy who wrote a note to Joe Biden that started with, "Dear Senator Biden, you are a
You know
traitor."
what though, Susan? I actually debunked that. I was the first one to because I did a FOIA request. And
Okay.
so the FBI sent me, little old me in Iowa, a little CD-ROM of what the full letter was because in the FBI unclassified docs, or declassified docs, it looks like a horrible Xerox. So you can't even read the letter. So it starts with Dear Senator Biden, you are a traitor, but then it doesn't say what the rest of the letter says. So I wanted the letters. I wanted to see what the letter actually said. And a clear copy. So at first they sent me something, it looked identical to what was on the FBI.gov declassified docs. And I was like, no, I want the actual letter, like find a copy. So they eventually sent me a letter that it's still pretty bad, but you can actually read it. And it was like, if you compare that handwriting to JFK Jr.'s handwriting, his handwriting was terrible. It was awful. This handwriting looked like a female almost. And the stuff that was written in it, I mean, I wish I had it up right now. I could read it to you, but I did a show on it, a George Collection show on it about that letter and how I did not think that it was from JFK Jr. I wish it would. That would be cool if it was. Um, but it didn't look like his handwriting to me. So that's why I totally put that out there and because I was wondering, I'm like, what did the rest of the letter say? If it really was from JFK Jr., I've got to know what it said. Nobody
Well,
has ever talked about it or read the whole letter. So I
what I
I
heard
to
was
see
that
that.
it was written in response to a situation he had been apprised of, that someone was looking to kidnap him, and that Joe Biden was somehow involved with the people who were looking to kidnap him, which is why he called him a traitor.
I know at that same time there were lots of different kidnapping attempts and just different things that they were coming after him essentially, different people, and they were from other countries. I feel like some of them were from Colombia, which to me, when you hear Colombia, what I think of, I think of the CIA. I think of the mob. I think of the mafia and drug running and all that kind of stuff. So, um, you know, it wouldn't be that far-fetched to say that could have been done. But the letter that I read, just looking at handwriting, and again, I'm
Okay.
not, I'm not a handwriting expert, but it looked totally different. And I've seen JFK Jr.'s handwriting many times, and it's almost impossible to read it. Like, you have to really look hard and be able to read it to
Yeah, from what I
decipher what it
understand,
says.
not only did he have terrible handwriting, but he was an awful speller. And his mother kept saying to him, "Don't worry, your dad didn't spell well either." You know, the
Yeah,
implication being he became president, it all worked out. So
yeah,
there you are. You know, now here's the thing though. But if you had been told that there was a group out there that Joe Biden was connected with from Ukraine, and those people were looking to kidnap JFK Jr., that would have seemed a lot more logical, right?
right,
That
right.
time, yeah.
Well, we know that he was a traitor. I mean, he
Oh
is.
yeah.
We know that for sure. So whoever wrote the letter, whoever it was, if it was JFK Jr. or someone else, they were completely right. So,
This is true. I'm just saying that I remember reading that and just being very impressed. You know, that was talk about hit the nail on the head time for sure. Definitely.
right. What's crazy is why would they that everything is still redacted with those things? What's the
Not
point?
more, I hope.
Well, no, I mean, I haven't looked recently, so I should probably look again. But the last time I looked, everything with the JFK Jr., the kidnapping stuff, it was still redacted. I'm like, the guy's gone. He's out of the picture. So why would you not just let us know what the plan was? Why?
There's I have no idea what the reasoning is, and I doubt very much there is any reasoning. It's pretty much, oh, well, it's always been that way, so let's just leave it that way. And that's what they do. That's pretty much it.
Right.
So where are we now on that?
Okay, so we have
We've talked about the CIA now. So what else?
yay, and then we were military industrial complex.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
yes. Military industrial complex had had a sort of a closed loop running where they basically had contracts that went to military contractors, okay, that they paid millions and hundreds of millions of dollars for, and then they had the material and the hardware and all the other stuff that was going to the military to supply them for operations around the world. Now, this didn't work unless the military was actually busy and active and doing stuff.
Right.
During the Cold War, there wasn't an enormous amount of stuff going on in terms of what the American military was doing. They were not invading countries one after another. And this was something of a problem because they didn't need as much military hardware. They didn't have stuff that would get broken that had to be fixed. So the ability to award contracts worth millions of dollars wasn't really happening. Okay.
Right.
They had an army, but it was sufficient for their needs and everything else. Well, that wasn't enough. And then, you had at that time what was called the domino theory about communism.
Mhm.
And what the domino theory basically said was that if enough small countries fall to communism, what that means is that other small countries will fall as well. And eventually, everyone in the world will fall to communism, like knocking over dominoes. And what happens to that? So they were not interested in testing the domino theory to see if one small country could fall and then other countries would follow. They decided they were just going to keep these small countries from falling. And the country that was most important at that time was Vietnam. Okay, you had North Vietnam, which had become communist. You had South Vietnam, which wanted to remain a republic, and they weren't excited about any of this stuff. And there was a lot of civil, it was basically a civil war going on. But back in the 1950s, I think 1954, France got involved with them, trying to help them and keep all this stuff going. And that was like a hopeless situation. So around 1960 or 61, they got out and we started getting in. And eventually, what JFK was willing to authorize were military advisors who would go over there and train the Vietnamese on how to use weapons and how to fly airplanes and all kinds of other stuff. That's what they were there to do. Now, I know there was some stuff that was actually happening on the ground that Kennedy would have been briefed on, but it was not something that was flaring up into a major war at that particular time. And so what was happening was Kennedy decided he was going to pull the advisors out. He figured at that point they'd pretty much done what they needed to do. They trained everybody that they could and they needed to come home. And his plan was to bring home, I think, the first 500 or 1,000 troops for Christmas the following year. That was his plan. Except that as soon as Johnson got into office, he said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to make a commitment in Vietnam. Okay. Because that was the only way he could pay back his donors, the military industrial, the people who actually had that loop of profit going and going and going. I mean, I'm sure at this point your whole audience is aware that nobody goes to war if there's no money to be made. If
Correct.
you're not going to make money, nobody's going to war because there's just nothing in the world that's worth it.
Right.
So point is that that is what they did. And there was a lot of investigation done about this later. And in fact, if you go into Jim Garrison's records, Jim Garrison being the New Orleans DA, who was the first person, the only person to ever bring a case against someone in the Kennedy assassination, he looked into what the military was doing and how much was actually going on. The fact that Bell Helicopter had gotten military contracts, but they were almost bankrupt at the time it happened. And so there were a lot of military contractors who were getting a lot of money and being brought back to life on some level because they were getting all this money from the military in order to be able to wage war in Vietnam. And so with all of that ability to wage war, they weren't going to not do it.
Right.
So military industrial complex was definitely a big player in there. Their motivation was to have a president in office who is going to fully commit to going into Vietnam and doing our job there and then coming home.
Yeah.
It's sickening, isn't it? It
It's
really.
so sickening. And it's not just that. It's been going on forever. You hear, look at 9/11. Look at everything. I mean, every
Oh
time we go
yeah,
to war, it's just like whose pockets are being lined right now? Especially when some of these banks are funding both sides. So,
of course they are. My father used to go to the racetrack, not too terribly often, but when they went, like on a social outing with friends, he would find a race where they would have like less than 8 horses, and he would bet on every horse. So no matter what happened, he would always win. And I mean, that is the way a lot of these people operated.
right.
They would only bet if they could win, and that's how they did it.
Hmm.
So it's very sad. It is.
It is sad. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to talk about Lee Harvey Oswald and
Yes.
his true character because, guys, this is Susan's book. Forward to Camelot. This is the older version. She's got a newer cover now, but Forward to Camelot, it's a time travel book, which I love time travel stuff. So in the book, she goes back in time and she saves the president. And Lee Harvey Oswald, she is the main character. Katie is her name, correct? Katie. And she goes back and with the help of Lee Harvey Oswald, they save the president. So I thought that was interesting because every book I've ever read with time travel, they talk about how Lee Harvey Oswald was the only one who did it, and they just perpetuate the same stuff that we've been hearing for decades. So this was the first time you read a book and you're like, oh, wow, this is different. Lee Harvey Oswald is actually the good guy. So, Susan, what research did you do to come to that conclusion to create this different whole alternative character to what we've been taught?
You know, what's interesting was it was a very cumulative thing, Rachel. There were so many things that I was reading sometimes all at the same time, and I would hit something small and I would realize that piece doesn't fit. You know, when Oswald was young, certainly according to his brothers, he was very close to his older brother Robert. His stepbrother John Pick was someone he wasn't as close to because he was just much older.
Yeah.
But Robert wanted to go into the Marine Corps. I don't remember if he ever actually did, but he brought home his Marine manual, and Lee actually practically memorized it. And this is a kid who was dyslexic anyway and had trouble learning. So the fact that he could practically memorize something and read it over and over and over again until he got it, that tells you something about how excited he was about it. Um, that didn't fit because to me that was, you know, somebody who's going to memorize a Marine manual is someone who is a patriot and who
Mhm.
wants to serve his country and has good reasons for going in and doing these things. He was, they said he was, he had certainly had lost before he was born. His father died before he was born. So he was raised by a single mother who was working as I think, a practical nurse for a lot of his childhood. And then eventually, for a short period of time, they moved to New York City. I'm not really clear on why they did that, but they moved to New York City and he ended up becoming a bit of a truant. A lot of the reason for that, I think, was not because he didn't want to learn, but because having a Southern accent and his clothes not being as fashionable as his classmates, they made fun of him. And so to avoid being bullied and stuff, he would basically, be a truant. He'd run around, you know, Bronx Park Zoo and stuff like that. He memorized virtually every business in the Empire State Building. And there are many, 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 many businesses in the Empire State Building. He knew all of them. He memorized all the subway stops. He was a very bright kid. And that part did not fit in with all the other stuff I heard that he struggled and he this and yeah, he did struggle learning on some level. He wasn't being taught because this was long before anybody understood that dyslexic did not mean stupid. It just meant that there was a mechanical difficulty he had to overcome. He joined the Marines at the age of 17, had to get his mother's permission to do it, but he went off to see the world and all kinds of stuff. And it wasn't too long after he got into the Marines that he was recruited by um, basically naval intelligence. Okay. And that part got very interesting because there are many, many things he ended up doing over his Marine career that are surprising to us today. But if you put them in the context of he was doing a military, an assignment for intelligence, that wouldn't necessarily surprise you. I mean, one of the things Jim Garrison found out that shocked him was that Oswald had been trained in Russian, in the Russian language. And he thought, why would anybody do that? He was a radar operator. Why would he need to use Russian? But he apparently didn't do well on the Russian test that they gave him. And they kind of dismissed it as, well, he just didn't do well. He was stupid. And it turns out when he met his wife Marina at a dance after he had defected to the Soviet Union, um, she thought that he actually, with the accent that he used, she thought that he actually was a native Russian speaker and was just from another area of Russia than where she was from because he spoke so well. Okay, and that her remark has been misinterpreted many, many times over the years. So taking that for what it's worth.
Mhm.
But the whole thing is he, among other things, he ended up dating some, were they Japanese women? I'm not sure, but I think he was certainly in Japan for a while. He dated some Japanese women, and there seemed to be some surprise about this because the women that were going out with him were essentially sort of, I guess, high class hookers that
Mm.
only officers would have had access to. So how did he get access? How did he get all of this other stuff? And one of the things that was interesting in his medical records from the Marines, they mentioned that he had gotten venereal disease in the line of duty.
Hmm.
How do you get venereal disease in the line of duty unless you're doing something to elicit information from someone?
Right.
So all of that stuff was very, very interesting. And then let's jump ahead for just a second. The CIA, in the end of the 50s, which is the time when Oswald was in the military, had a program that they called the false defector program. The idea was they were going to take young men who may have had a military background, who would approach the Soviet Union, tell them that they were disaffected Americans, they were military people, they had military information, and they would send them over to the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
Now, there were a number of these men who actually did this. And there have been interviews with people who were in the false defector program, who had gone to the Soviet Union, who had come back, and who had stuff to tell about that. But the whole point is that the Soviet Union, or sorry, the CIA wanted to train these people to be able to live on their own, to be able to act without having a handler there, and then to come back and give them a debriefing, which would tell them what they needed to know about what was going on in the Soviet Union. So there's some thought that when Oswald defected, he was not a real defector. He told them he wanted to renounce his US citizenship and get Soviet citizenship. He was taken away by the Soviets and I suppose grilled for a long time. They brought him back. They gave him a certain amount of money. He got a very roomy apartment in a very in a place where it's really hard to do that. He had a certain amount of privacy. He had a certain amount of privilege. He worked in a what was it? It was a factory, a radio factory in Minsk or something. And he was there for a period of time. Among other things, he dated local girls. He met Marina. He married her there. They had their first child, June. And when he decided, I've had enough of the Soviet Union, he got a passport and a visa to travel within 24 hours. The US government loaned him the money to travel and brought him back. And
Wow.
they brought Marina back as well, which is something that you just didn't do. You couldn't get women that you loved, Russian sweethearts, you couldn't get them out of Russia. You just couldn't. But he did. So take that for what it's worth. He also wrote something that he called his historic diary about his period of time in the Soviet Union. He wrote about that, and that I am sure made its way not only to, because they say, I think he thought he was going to write a book or something and it was going to sell 1 billion copies, but it certainly made its way, I'm sure, to the intelligence community as part of his debriefing. So all of that was going on. Then he immediately gets involved in working in Dallas, spends some time there, decides that's not good, and goes back to New Orleans, which is where he was raised. Spends the summer there and meets Judith Very Baker, who is I think she's like 19 years old or something at the time. And she is a genius high school student who has a deep interest in curing cancer. She wants to get involved with that, and she is taken under the wing of Dr. Alton Ochner, Altonochner, who is the most prominent cancer researcher in the country at the time. Okay. He has clinics all over the place, and he has told her that if you will come and work with me, kind of as an apprentice for the summer, we will get you into like Tulane University in the fall, and you'll be able to get on a straight program toward a pre-med degree so that you can actually start doing medical research. Okay, which is what she really wanted. Her grandmother had died of cancer. She wanted to be able to cure cancer, and she started working on it almost immediately and was winning science fairs and all kinds of stuff in high school. She also did something which was very, very relevant to what was going on in New Orleans, and that was she had developed a reputation for being able to induce cancer in lab rats faster than anyone else had ever done it.
Wow.
Now, if you're trying to cure cancer and you're trying to test it on lab rats, it's very useful to have somebody that can induce cancer in the lab rats, don't you think?
Yeah. I'd say.
Definitely. Yeah. So what happens? She arrives in New Orleans and goes to the post office to pick up a letter, and the person standing behind her in line was Lee Harvey Oswald. They strike up a conversation. He starts speaking Russian to her, and the next thing you know, they're in love. A lot of things are going on. Now she is involved with someone else who she actually ends up marrying that summer. But it becomes very clear toward the end of the summer that she and Lee really want to be together. They're both preparing to divorce their spouses and marry each other. And in fact, Lee has figured out a way to actually get them out of the whole intelligence thing. He is at this point working with David Ferry, who is a CIA pilot who's been involved in training a lot of the anti-Castro Cubans for yet another invasion of Cuba. That's another thing that they wanted to do. Again, this is the whole story is so complex that it takes so much time to explain because there are so many motivations, there are so many reasons for all the things that are going on. It's just hard to kind of, I'm so used to knowing the story that it's kind of hard to tell it in regular order. But the main thing really is that Oswald had he was aware, by the way, as of that summer in New Orleans, he was aware that there was going to be an attempt on Kennedy's life. He further was aware that he was the person who was going to be targeted as the patsy. He knew this was going to happen. It was not a surprise.
Do you think we talked about this the last episode. Do you feel like it's because he was the one who warned the Secret Service about the Chicago, or is it something
No,
completely different?
no, he had been targeted long before that because, as I told you in the last episode, they would have needed time to set him up to make him look like the violent, lone, crazed nut that people could come forward and say, "Oh, I met him and he did this and he did
Yeah.
that." You can't do it in 2 weeks. You've got to have time to do it. So the truth was is that they were already setting it up and he was already aware of it. And she actually spoke to him the night before the assassination on that Thursday night. They had their last conversation on the phone. He was at this point in Dallas. She had actually left New Orleans and gone to Florida, and they're chatting. And she says, "Listen, if you're not there tomorrow, they will not have the assassination because you have to be there in order for them to be able to blame it on you." And he says, "Look, I have to be there. I have to take the chance." And she said, "Why would you do that? You know what's going to happen. You know they're going to do this." And he said, "I have a chance to try to save Kennedy. I'm going to take that chance. And I'm just going to take that chance. If I have the slightest chance that I can save Kennedy's life, then I'm going to be there to make that happen." And as I think I told you, there was a second faction going on in Dallas that day, which was sort of the anti-assassination faction. These are the people trying to stop the event from happening. Okay. Oswald was part of that. I think J.D. Tippit, who is the police officer who was shot in Oak Cliff right after the assassination, I think he was part of it. There are a number of the people who were part of it and trying to stop it from happening. It just wasn't possible. So the thing is, and in fact, by the way, in Forward to Camelot, there is a moment when Lee and the other people in the thing, including the Kennedys, end up in a place where Lee believes that he has one of those people in the faction to try to save Kennedy, and it turns out not the way he wants it to turn out, obviously.
Right.
So, but the whole thing is that there were so many qualities about him that I started reading about and thinking, this guy really had some stuff on the ball. He was amazing. He was interesting. He was smart. He was very, very good at doing the things he was asked to do. He was being given intelligence assignments all the time. Judith was talking for a long time about they got jobs together at the same place where she would cover for him and like sign him out later than he was supposed to have been signed out because he was off doing intelligence stuff and all this stuff was going on. So there were a lot of things that people thought that he had done and they couldn't figure out how he could have done it. Well, it was because he had somebody else there who was helping make sure that that was the case. So
And I remember from our very, very first episode, you had said you sent a copy of your book to her, right? To
I
Judith.
did. I did.
And tell us what she said.
She read it and she sent me a very sweet note back and she said, "This is the person he was. And I'm so glad that you did this because this is the person I hope the world will see." And I'm so grateful for that. It was a lovely note and I was thrilled that she had gotten that reaction because that was the person I thought he was, and against all historical evidence, I just didn't believe all the historical evidence was right. And the idea that, he was violent, he was crazy, he was miserable, he was a terrible person. He was always, people sometimes will look at someone who's quiet and they'll think of them as sullen, not quiet, but just seething with anger and all kinds of stuff. And that is not necessarily always the case. Now, he had his moments for sure, but the flying off the handle, becoming a psychotic sociopath, that just was not him.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, I think he might have done some very interesting things had he lived, but one way or the other, I truly believe he was trying to save Kennedy. I truly believe that was his real motivation for all of that. And I think I don't know the truth of this, but if he had somehow traded his life for Kennedy's and been able to save Kennedy by giving up his life, I think he would have considered it well worth lost. So take it for what it's worth. I can't give any historical background for that. I can only tell you that I believe that based on what I know of him, that is what might have been in his mind. Is if I have to make the sacrifice, then I will.
And there's a really good scene in this book that kind of goes through a lot of what you just said, but I'm not going to give that part away. So,
Well, thank you.
Susan, thank you so much. This was our second episode of three. Again, guys, if you have any questions for Susan about anything we talked about, either in this episode or the previous one, or if you have bought Susan's book and you have a question that you just want to know, like, hey, how'd you come up with this? Put it in the comments and we will ask her next week on our third and final episode of our three-part series. Susan, thank you so much for coming back and discussing all this stuff. I always learn a lot when I have you on, but I hope everyone else did too. And we'll see you in one more week.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled. Thanks for having me, Rachel. Take
Thanks.
care, everybody.
Bye, guys.